the galaxy preserves certain anomalies that resist classification, records that chart disturbances too deliberate to be the product of chance. There are ruins of civilizations that collapsed without evidence of war, planets where populations vanished within a single generation, and scattered entries describing entire sectors that fell silent with no external invasion to explain their absence. The accounts vary in detail, but they share a pattern: silence where there should have been resistance, and an absence of survivors where once there had been thriving societies. Some of these records are ancient, their dates stretching back into the earliest epochs of recorded history, others more recent but no less enigmatic. They describe phenomena where defences failed not because of external sieges, but because those who held the walls ceased to act in their own interest. The result is always similar: an enemy within, invisible until the collapse is total. The first references appear in connection to the catastrophic changes that overtook the galaxy during the decline of the ancient Aeldari Empire. At that time, the warp itself experienced a violent transformation. The psychic excess of the Aeldari species, magnified over millennia of unchecked indulgence, culminated in the birth of a god within the Immaterium, an event whose destructive aftershocks reshaped the material universe. In those centuries, the boundary between the warp and the material realm thinned catastrophically, permitting entities that had previously remained contained to cross freely. Among these were predators without form or limitation, whose primary function was not the destruction of bodies or the dismantling of fortresses, but the exploitation of psychic channels themselves. They arrived as parasites, moving through the minds of those capable of touching the warp, and used these connections to force open passageways for their kind. Later observers assigned them many names, but the designation that remained was chosen for its simplicity: they enslaved. Their first encounters with mortal species demonstrated this principle with clarity. They did not wage wars through conventional armies, nor did they rely on physical weapons of destruction. Instead, they compromised populations by entering through the thoughts of individuals who were psychically sensitive, reshaping the will of those minds into obedience. These individuals then became gateways, anchors that allowed additional entities to manifest within real space. Through this recursive process, the spread accelerated. What had begun as a single compromised psyker would become a chain of infestations, each new host enabling more entities to emerge, until entire populations were repurposed into unwilling extensions of an alien intelligence. Descriptions of their biology are fragmented, for they do not conform to any stable form in the way that corporeal species do. Witnesses describe them as bulbous, shifting masses of tissue, often resembling floating spheres of unnatural flesh, with appendages that extend or retract without pattern. Eyes, sensory organs, or growths appear across their surfaces, and they alter in number and shape seemingly at will. Their method of locomotion is equally disquieting, with many accounts describing them drifting above the ground or through void without visible propulsion. When they touch matter, it is often corrosive, leaving behind marks or residues as if their substance were incompatible with the material universe. Their apparent size ranges widely depending on the account, but the majority of records describe them as large enough to dwarf a human form, with some observations suggesting mass comparable to armoured war machines, though no consistency exists across encounters. What unifies the testimonies is that the physical manifestation of an enslaver is less important than the psychic field it generates. In biological terms of height or weight, no fixed data can be given. They do not weigh as a body of flesh and bone would weigh, nor do they grow as organisms do. They are warp entities, whose presence in material space is a projection anchored to hosts. The host defines the limitations. Without psychic life forms to exploit, they cannot easily maintain form. This explains why their invasions always coincide with the presence of abundant psykers. The increase of psychic potential within a population corresponds directly to an increased likelihood of enslaver manifestation. Their biology, therefore, is less a question of material attributes and more of psychic resonance. They are patterns of hunger and control, given partial body only when the circumstances allow it. The defining trait of these entities lies in their ability to seize control of other beings. A psyker becomes not merely a servant but a puppet, his mind hollowed and redirected to the purpose of propagating further gateways. Once dominated, the host no longer resists, functioning as a node in a growing network of enslavement. Control extends beyond the psychic individual to those in proximity, creating chains of subjugated organisms who carry out the entity's will without conscious opposition. Unlike demonic possession, which often tears apart its host through incompatibility, the control exercised by these entities leaves the body intact, functioning, and disturbingly normal in appearance. The difference lies in purpose. The demonic host may self-destruct or act in wild violence, but those enslaved by these creatures persist, obey, and continue daily motions until their usefulness is exhausted. Their goals are consistent across all records that survive. They do not establish empires, nor do they preserve conquests. They consume populations through enslavement until those resources are depleted, then move on. Expansion is not motivated by accumulation of wealth, territory, or ideology, but by biological necessity. To spread is to survive. They reproduce only through the presence of hosts, requiring a continuous cycle of infestation. In this way, they are not conquerors in the sense of the Astartes or the Necrontyr, but rather a parasitic force whose purpose is to propagate itself across the galaxy. Their goals are not framed in concepts of victory or defeat, but in persistence and multiplication. If a world falls silent under their influence, it is not reorganized or occupied, but drained of psychic life until no more growth can occur. What remains is an empty husk, devoid of order or meaning, marked by the passage of an intelligence that extracts and abandons. Scholars who attempt to categorize them argue over whether their origin should be considered mythical, scientific, or purely Immaterium-based. From the mythical perspective, they are interpreted as predators born from the death cries of the war in heaven, when the struggle between the Necrontyr, the Catan, and the Old Ones reshaped the balance of psychic life. In this view, they are one of many aftershocks, creatures whose existence is tied to the psychic echoes of battles too vast to contain. From the scientific perspective, they are studied as emergent organisms within the warp ecosystem, opportunistic predators that simply evolve to exploit weaknesses in psychic species. This line of thought treats them as natural, if abhorrent, expressions of Immaterium biology. The third perspective, favoured by the Inquisition, denies any separation between the mythical and scientific. They are warp-born, and the warp is itself beyond full rational explanation. They are therefore simply one more form of predatory Immaterium entity, no more mythical than demons but no more scientific either, inhabiting the same uncertain boundary. The consistency across all perspectives is their functional role. They do not align themselves with the chaos powers, nor do they appear to recognize the hierarchies of demons. Their goals remain singular and detached, without evidence of allegiance or ideology. They are independent predators, outsiders within the warp who hunt along pathways opened by psychic species. This independence makes them uniquely dangerous, for no pact or negotiation has ever been recorded that could alter their behaviour. The only response available to those who encounter them is eradication, containment, or, when impossible, isolation through quarantine. When one considers the span of their recorded presence, a clear theme emerges. They thrive in moments of collapse. The decline of the Aeldari provided fertile ground for their manifestation. The growing psychic potential of humanity in the later millennia provided new opportunities. Wherever the veil thins and psychers proliferate, the threat of their appearance increases. They are opportunists, waiting for the natural tendencies of civilizations to produce the conditions they require. This patience has ensured their survival across ages when other powers have risen and fallen. They require no empire, no armies, no weapons beyond their ability to enslave. Their biology is the exploitation of biology itself, their goal the endless replication of their pattern. It is within these traits that one understands why their name endured. They are enslavers not because of the forms they take, nor because of the destruction they leave behind. but because their fundamental act is to strip away the autonomy of all who encounter them. They are a presence without ideology, without culture, without language, defined entirely by the act of turning others into extensions of themselves. This act erases the line between victim and predator, leaving only a chain of controlled beings who advance the spread of the species. The end state is always the same: silence where there was once speech, obedience where there was once thought, and an absence where there was once life. The structure of the enslaver species presents one of the most enigmatic challenges in Xenos classification. Whereas most intelligent species encountered by humanity display recognizable systems of hierarchy, whether political, military, or biological, the enslavers exist as an apparent contradiction. On one hand, they exhibit no clear signs of leadership or division of castes, at least none perceptible through conventional observation. On the other hand, their behavior suggests a disturbing level of coordination that cannot be easily explained by coincidence or mere instinct. It is possible, though never confirmed, that the enslavers operate through a distributed intelligence, a network of psychic resonance in which each organism functions as both an autonomous predator and a fragment of a collective whole. Whether this represents a hive mind in the traditional sense or a looser synchronization through the Immaterium remains unresolved. What is observable is that enslavers rarely act alone once they have crossed into real space. Their manifestations are often reported in clusters, as if drawn to the same point of psychic disturbance or the same prey species. This suggests that while they may not follow leaders in the conventional manner, their psychic senses resonate with such similarity that multiple individuals converge on identical signals. The result is the impression of a coordinated hunt, one that magnifies their destructive potential far beyond what a single entity might achieve. This form of coordination renders conventional tactics of misdirection, isolation, or fragmentation far less effective than they would be against more traditional predators. In terms of roles, the enslaver organism appears to embody all necessary functions for survival and propagation within a single body. There are no distinct workers, warriors, or reproductive castes. Rather, each enslaver is capable of opening rifts to the Immaterium, enslaving and manipulating hosts, and reproducing psychically through subjugated life forms. This lack of specialization contributes to the perception of them as a swarm of interchangeable threats. The absence of dependence on hierarchical roles means that the destruction of individual organisms has little to no strategic effect in halting their advance. Each surviving entity carries the full capacity to perpetuate the species. In this sense, their greatest strength lies in their redundancy, for no individual is vital and none can be considered expendable. They are all equally dangerous. Their abilities are the foundation of their horror. The enslaver's most defining trait is their psychic dominance, a power so absolute that it penetrates even fortified minds. Victims are subjected not merely to external control, but to an invasive rewriting of will, leaving them as hollow extensions of the enslaver's intent. Unlike more familiar cases of possession or compulsion, the control of an enslaver leaves little room for resistance or recovery. Once under their sway, the enslaved cannot be liberated except by death. This renders their predation particularly devastating among species reliant on psychic capacity, as the very gifts that grant communication with the warp are twisted into vulnerabilities that invite their doom. The precise mechanics of this control remain uncertain, though evidence suggests a combination of psychic resonance and Immaterium tethering. The enslaver projects a form of mental tether that overrides the subject's natural consciousness, erasing its sense of self while leaving its physical and psychic functions intact. Through this tether, the creature can not only command behavior, but also induce the subject to act as a beacon, channeling energies that tear rifts wider and draw more of its kind into real space. In effect, the enslaved become both servants and tools of infestation, spreading the very conditions of their own species' subjugation. The effects on other races vary depending on their level of psychic attunement. Humans, with their fragile yet widespread psychic sensitivity, are particularly vulnerable. Entire settlements have been reported lost when the emergence of even a small number of latent psykers created the conditions for enslaver intrusion. The victims, once bound, became conduits, amplifying the psychic rift until the infestation overwhelmed entire regions. Attempts by imperial authorities to quarantine these outbreaks often resulted in mass extermination of the population, as any effort short of annihilation proved insufficient. The Aeldari, though vastly more powerful in psychic terms, faced a different form of peril. Their sensitivity to the warp made them highly visible targets, ensuring that wherever enslavers roamed, Aeldari presences became beacons of attraction. In pre-fall eras, encounters with the enslavers were recorded with dread, not because the Aeldari could not resist individually, but because the very act of their existence drew more of the predators into being. A single captured Aeldari could magnify the beacon to catastrophic levels, summoning waves of enslavers until even disciplined defences collapsed. Thus, the species' very strength was twisted into liability, an inversion that made them loathed even among those civilizations advanced enough to comprehend the true scale of the threat. Other species with limited psychic development fared differently. The orcs, for instance, displayed a paradoxical resistance and vulnerability. Their gestalt psychic field, bound in crude collective thought rather than individual precision, appeared difficult for the enslavers to dominate in the conventional sense. Yet this same psychic haze acted as a broad spectrum signal, potentially luring enslavers across great distances. Entire wars are suspected to have been diverted or dissolved not by imperial campaigns, but by sudden infestations of enslavers drawn to the warband's uncontrolled psychic resonance. In such cases, the orcs were less enslaved than eradicated, their crude psychic signatures serving as bait that led to their destruction. The Tau, by contrast, demonstrated near immunity. Their species' near total absence of psychic ability rendered them invisible to the creatures. Where enslaver infestations erupted across human worlds, Tau settlements often reported no contact at all. This absence has occasionally led imperial scholars to speculate on the evolutionary advantage of psychic sterility, though such discussions rarely last long, given the Imperium's dependence on psykers for survival. What is certain is that the Tau are uniquely positioned to survive in the shadows of the enslavers' predations, though whether this is through natural chance or deliberate design remains unanswered. The lasting effects of enslaver contact go beyond immediate devastation. Their presence destabilizes regions of real space by tearing thin the veil between reality and the Immaterium. Even after their withdrawal or extermination, such scars can persist, leaving behind warp storms or weakened boundaries that invite demonic incursion. In this sense, their influence extends beyond the lifespan of individual infestations. They leave behind poisoned worlds, psychic wastelands, and unstable zones that remain dangerous for millennia. The damage they cause is thus not confined to the period of their presence, but becomes woven into the ongoing instability of the galaxy. Perhaps the most insidious effect is psychological rather than physical. To those who survive encounters with the enslavers, there is no mistaking the utter helplessness of standing before them. Species that rely on willpower, discipline, or psychic fortitude find all such strength stripped away. The survivors often speak of voices that were not their own, of thoughts that seemed to betray them, of a gradual hollowing out of identity until nothing remained. Though these testimonies are rare, since survival itself is uncommon, they have been preserved in fragmented records that circulate within the Ordo Xenos. To the Inquisition, they serve as both warnings and justifications for the strictest measures, for any species capable of reducing intelligent beings to empty husks cannot be tolerated under any circumstance. The enslavers therefore cannot be categorized merely as another predatory Xenos race. They are not invaders in the conventional sense, seeking territory or conquest, nor parasites in the traditional biological sense, seeking sustenance alone. Their role appears to lie somewhere between predator, conqueror, and force of nature. They consume not just flesh, but autonomy, identity, and will. The enslaved do not live in any recognizable way, nor do they die until their bodies collapse under the strain of serving a will not their own. They exist in a liminal state, no longer themselves but not yet fully other, a testament to the unique horror the Enslavers bring to all who encounter them. The war in heaven was already a conflict of impossible magnitude before the Enslavers entered its scope. It began as the confrontation between the ancient Necrontyr, who became the Necrons, and the Old Ones, who had for aeons been unrivaled as masters of the galaxy. Through their mastery of the warp and their manipulation of life, the Old Ones had cultivated a galactic order that seemed unshakable. They had engineered species capable of surviving across diverse worlds, had fostered civilizations that would one day form the foundations of countless empires, and had used their psychic might to impose order where chaos threatened. Against them rose the Necrons, fueled by hatred for their ancient rivals, and empowered by the pact they forged with the star gods known as the C'tan. With weapons of unimaginable potency and armies of living metal, the Necrons waged a war of annihilation. For long spans of time, the Old Ones resisted. Their warp mastery gave them the means to counteract the C'tan's destructive energies. They deployed psychic constructs, controlled vast networks of webway gates, and shaped younger races into instruments of war against the Necrons. Yet their strategy contained the seeds of their undoing. In their desperation to build resistance across the galaxy, the Old Ones accelerated the evolution of psychic potential among the species they fostered. What had once been a gradual unfolding of psychic sensitivity was now violently catalyzed. Worlds teemed with emerging psychers, and the fabric of the warp was strained by the sudden growth of psychic energy radiating from real space. The Old Ones had intended this proliferation to be their greatest weapon. Instead, it became their most fatal weakness. It was within this context that the Enslavers emerged as more than a distant threat. Long before the war in heaven, there had been scattered reports of their presence. Even in the earliest ages of the galaxy, when the Old Ones reigned unchallenged, some records whisper of predators that move between dimensions, feeding on the energies of the warp and reducing civilizations to thralls. Yet the scale of their incursions in those ancient times was limited, for psychic resonance had not yet saturated the galaxy in the way it would during the height of the war. The Old Ones, confident in their power, may have dismissed the threat as manageable. But as the conflict with the Necrons escalated, the galaxy became fertile ground for Enslaver manifestation. The growing psychic pressure created by billions of nascent psychers acted as a beacon across the Immaterium. Warp boundaries thinned, and where once the Enslavers required rare circumstances to cross into real space, they now found countless doorways forced open by the very races the Old Ones had cultivated. Each act of psychic creation became an invitation, and the predators answered with unrelenting hunger. They poured into real space in greater numbers than ever before, converging on worlds where the Old Ones had established their strongest holds and their most promising subjects. The Enslavers did not come as allies of the Necrons, nor as intentional instruments of the C'tan. They were opportunistic, driven only by the imperatives of their nature, but their timing and their spread ensured that they became decisive factors in the downfall of the Old Ones. The Enslavers struck in ways that conventional war could not counter. Necron weaponry devastated flesh, shattered planets, and silenced stars, but even the might of their gas flayers and world engines could not erase the warp itself. The Old Ones, who had for so long relied on psychic mastery as both shield and spear, found their greatest strength twisted against them. Their fostered species were turned from defenders into conduits of infestation. Enslaved psychers opened rifts that allowed more predators to arrive, and soon entire regions once loyal to the Old Ones fell without a single Necron intervention. Where the Necrons destroyed civilizations with metal and fire, the Enslavers hollowed them out from within, reducing once proud defenders to extensions of alien will. The fall of the Old Ones was therefore not simply the product of Necron victory. It was the combined consequence of external war and internal collapse. The Enslavers stripped away the pillars of the Old Ones' galactic order, leaving them surrounded not by allies but by hollowed shells. Their mastery of the warp, once the foundation of their dominance, became a curse. Each attempt to resist the Necrons through psychic warfare drew more predators into the galaxy, multiplying the crisis until even the greatest achievements of the Old Ones could not stave off the unravelling. In this way, the Enslavers served as the final undoing of an empire that had endured since time immemorial. The aftermath of their emergence reshaped the galaxy for millennia. The Old Ones, broken and scattered, withdrew into obscurity or perished altogether. The Necrons, though victorious against their ancient rivals, did not emerge unscathed. The Enslavers were indiscriminate in their predation. They consumed and enslaved wherever psychic presence could be found, and the galaxy at that time was filled with the echoes of countless battles and the psychic detritus of war. The Necrons, though largely immune due to their soulless nature, saw the galaxy around them descend into chaos. They had destroyed their great enemy, but the galaxy that remained was uninhabitable, scarred by warp breaches and infested by predators beyond their control. This realization was one of the factors that drove the Necrons into their long slumber, entombing themselves until the galaxy might one day be free of the horrors unleashed in the wake of their victory. The species fostered by the Old Ones fared little better. Many of them perished entirely, consumed by the Enslavers before they could fully mature into independent civilizations. Others survived in scattered remnants, forced into regression and isolation to escape the predators that had once been drawn to their worlds. The warp storms and infestations that followed the Old Ones' collapse ensured that vast regions of the galaxy became impassable, locked away in turbulence that would persist for untold ages. Where once there had been unity under the guidance of the Old Ones, there was now fragmentation, extinction, and silence. From this aftermath, the galaxy entered an age of ruin. Civilizations that might have risen in the shadow of the Old Ones were cut short. Psychic potential became as much a danger as it was a strength, for to reveal such power was to risk drawing the attention of predators lurking just beyond the veil. It was only in much later epochs, long after the worst of the enslaver infestations had receded, that species such as humanity, the Eldar, and others could begin to grow into the dominant forces of their respective eras. The legacy of the Enslavers was thus not merely the destruction of the Old Ones, but the enforced resetting of galactic history. They ensured that the ancient order could never be rebuilt, that the galaxy would remain fractured and unstable, and that new powers would have to rise not in continuity but in struggle against the scars of what had come before. The role of the Enslavers in this transformation cannot be understated. They were not generals, not rulers, not conquerors in any intentional sense, yet their presence was decisive in one of the greatest wars the galaxy has ever known. By their very nature, they thrive where psychic abundance flourishes, and the Old Ones' reliance on such energies guaranteed their doom. The predators did not act with purpose beyond their instinctual hunger, but in doing so, they accomplished what the Necrons and the Catan alone might never have achieved. They erased the galaxy's greatest civilization and cast its legacy into obscurity. For the Imperium of Man, studying these events is more than an academic exercise. It is a cautionary tale, one preserved in fragments across the archives of the Inquisition and whispered among the savants of the Ordo Xenos. The rise of psychic power is never without consequence, and the proliferation of psychers across the galaxy may yet draw the predators back in force. The memory of the Old One's downfall serves as a grim reminder that no mastery of the warp is secure, no matter how absolute it may appear. In the end, the Enslavers are not defeated by strength or strategy. They arrive when the conditions of the galaxy invite them, and they depart only when nothing remains worth consuming. The war in heaven ended not with triumph but with collapse, and the Enslavers ensured that collapse was absolute. In their wake lay the ruins of empires, the silence of extinct species, and the scars of a galaxy still haunted by their presence. Though their incursions are rarer in the current age, their role in shaping the course of history remains undeniable. They were the predators that arrived at the moment of greatest vulnerability, and they fed until the galaxy itself became barren of what they sought. The downfall of the Old Ones was therefore not merely the victory of the Necrons, but the victory of inevitability. of predators whose existence was bound to the excesses of psychic power. It was a victory written not in strategy but in hunger, and its echoes still shape the galaxy 10 million years later. When the vast imperial bureaucracy of the Adeptus Administratum and the logic-bound priesthood of the Adeptus Mechanicus turned their attention to the creatures classified as enslavers, the results were neither uniform nor complete. Both institutions, while indispensable in maintaining order across the galaxy, are fundamentally shaped by limitations. The Administratum by its obsession with record-keeping and codification, and the Mechanicus by its dogmatic framework of the quest for knowledge bounded by fear of the warp. In both cases, the enslavers presented anomalies that resisted convenient categories. For the Adeptus Administratum, the earliest contacts with the enslavers did not stem from battle reports, but from patterns in population records and settlement data. Civilized worlds in otherwise stable sectors experienced sudden collapses in demographic structure, with entire planetary populations vanishing into chaos within months. Administratum scribes noted catastrophic reductions in workforce statistics, tithing yields, and infrastructure productivity. To the civilian bureaucracy, the enslavers first appeared as statistical irregularities. They were registered not as a biological species, but as an event type, sudden, unclassifiable, and devastating. Administratum archivists were trained to reduce unknowns to numbers, so the early phenomenon of enslaver infestations became documented as population suppression events, later appended with the designation Xenos parasitica. This reductionist view extended to the lexicon employed in imperial records. The Administratum seldom described the enslavers as creatures, but as agents of nullification. Their presence rendered entire settlements strategically irrelevant, erasing tax rolls, troop levies, and agricultural contributions. Thus, Administratum scribes came to define them by absence: the absence of viable tithes, the absence of civilian compliance, the absence of planetary coherence. This tendency hardened into policy. Enslaver outbreaks were not primarily flagged as biological crises, but as fiscal and logistical emergencies. The bureaucratic instinct was to classify them alongside other resource-voiding events, such as warp storms, plague worlds, or exterminatus. This depersonalized approach may have stripped away much of the biological and tactical detail that a more rigorous military dossier would require, but it provided the Administratum with a framework it understood: the removal of value from imperial possession. By contrast, the Adeptus Mechanicus framed the enslavers in profoundly different terms. Their priesthood, long preoccupied with the relationship between the material and the immaterial, saw in these beings both a threat and a heretical puzzle. Mechanicus Magi had long attempted to define Xenos species according to taxonomical machine logica, grounding alien forms within schematics of order and function. The enslavers, however, resisted such neat classifications. They were not simply biological entities, nor were they entirely immaterial warp phantoms. Their method of arrival into real space, through psychic anchors in the minds of unprotected psychers, blurred the line between material cause and immaterial effect. To the Mechanicus, the enslavers became recorded as anomalous bio-warp conduits. Reports from explorator fleets noted their flesh was organic, yet carried mutations consistent with continuous warp saturation. Their function, dominating psychers to create portals into real space, suggested a living technology, a perverse analogue to the Mechanicus' own aspirations of binding the immaterial through machinery. Where the Mechanicus sought to contain the machine spirit within sanctified engines, the enslavers contained the warp within living conduits of bone and flesh. Mechanicus' commentary on their physiology demonstrates the tension between curiosity and revulsion. Magibiology has described their structures as simultaneously inefficient and grotesquely effective. Their bodies were poorly armoured, fragile compared to other predators, yet their mastery over psychic domination and compensated entirely, enabling them to bypass conventional defences. In effect, they were described as designs of intent without symmetry, evidence to some Mechanicus theologians of the warp itself experimenting in mockery of the Omnissiah's divine order. To classify them within sacred schema, The Mechanicus often labelled them with terms denoting corruption, flesh technologies of the Immaterium, or cognitive possession engines. These were not neutral categories, but attempts to fit them into the theology of the quest for knowledge, where all anomalies must either be sanctified or condemned. A significant divergence between Administratum and Mechanicus impressions lies in their treatment of the enslaver threat's origin. The Administratum avoided speculation, noting only proximate causes: the presence of uncontrolled psychers, the collapse of civil order, and the consequent requirement for quarantine or purgation. The Mechanicus, however, pursued obsessive theorization. Magi debated whether the enslavers were truly native to the warp or merely symbiotic predators of it. Some argued that they were warp parasites, dependent on psychers to open gateways, implying a limitation that could be weaponized. Others considered them the embryonic stage of something greater, living apertures whose presence foreshadowed more destructive incursions. Despite these differences, both institutions arrived at the same operational conclusion. Enslavers necessitated eradication at any cost. Administratum decrees ordered tithe waivers for sectors under infestation only after exterminatus had been declared or resettlement abandoned, indicating the difficulty of reconciling their survival with continued productivity. The Mechanicus, while driven to study them, regularly concluded that contamination outweighed discovery. Biological samples were rare, and containment often ended in disaster. Consequently, many Mechanicus edicts recorded the enslavers as among the non-recoverable technologies, anomalies too dangerous for sanctioned research, placed under permanent interdiction. A subtler difference exists in the ethics underlying these institutional impressions. The Administratum, being a civilian body, processed the enslavers as another calamity of governance. Their response was detached, a matter of paperwork, quotas, and revised ledgers. The human suffering behind those statistics was buried in margins. The Mechanicus, however, couched its impressions in theological rhetoric. Enslavers were not simply hostile organisms, but affronts to the machine god's order, anti-technologies born of heretical origin. This spiritual lens coloured every Mechanicus record, ensuring that even pragmatic observations were expressed in the language of blasphemy and prohibition. The cross-comparison of these impressions demonstrates the limits of imperial knowledge itself. Neither the Administratum's fixation on resource nullification, nor the Mechanicus' obsession with corrupted design produced a comprehensive understanding of the enslavers. Instead, imperial archives are filled with fragments, population collapse figures, tithe reduction notices, prohibition seals, scattered dissection notes. Together, they construct a picture less of what the enslavers are, and more of how the Imperium struggles to process the incomprehensible within frameworks it can tolerate. The enslavers are not remembered for campaigns of territorial conquest or structured wars of expansion. Unlike the Orcs, Tyranids, or Aeldari, they possess no empire, no consolidated fleets, and no need for resources in the conventional sense. Their wars are not fought for land or wealth, but are consequences of their method of survival. Enslaver incursions manifest where psychic activity creates vulnerabilities, often emerging without warning, escalating rapidly into planetary collapse, and dissipating once hosts are consumed. As such, there are few recorded wars in the traditional sense. Instead, imperial archives preserve fragmentary accounts of isolated infestations, failed containment operations, and desperate eradication campaigns. Collectively, these engagements form the imperfect record of how the Imperium has encountered and resisted them. The most widely cited example of an enslaver outbreak is the ancient event often referred to as the War of the Enslavers. This predates the rise of the Imperium itself and is preserved in fragmentary Mechanicus lore and Elder myth. During the aftermath of the War in Heaven, as the Necrons withdrew into their tombs and the Old Ones vanished, the warp was thrown into violent instability. The psychic shockwaves of countless dying species and the rise of nascent warp entities created openings through which the enslavers entered real space in vast numbers. For much of the galaxy, this was less a war and more an extermination. Civilizations weakened by millennia of conflict were consumed as enslaver infestations cascaded across the stars. This event shaped much of later Xenos history, as species with any psychic potential were systematically devastated. To the Mechanicus, this ancient outbreak is recorded not as myth but as a data point, evidence of how enslavers, when unchecked, can become a galactic-level extinction force. In the age of the Imperium, however, most documented engagements are smaller in scale. A common pattern is the sudden collapse of a single hive city, agri-settlement, or mining colony, with survivors reporting strange figures moving in shadows, mass disappearances, and outbreaks of uncontrolled psychic possession. By the time an Imperial response is mounted, entire civilian populations may already be compromised. The combat report suggests that Imperial Guard units sent against enslaver infestations rarely fought pitched battles in open terrain. Instead, their operations resembled purges, moving block by block through ruined cities, attempting to eliminate enslaved hosts while avoiding direct exposure to psychic domination. The case of Pithos Secundus, preserved in an administratum redaction, illustrates the difficulty of such engagements. When local astropaths reported distress signals suggesting psychic anomalies, the Astra Militarum dispatched 2 regiments to investigate. By the time they landed, the world's capital was already silent. Vox recordings recovered later indicate that the regiments were not defeated by conventional enemy firepower, but by disintegration of morale and command. Officers were enthralled, soldiers turned their weapons on their comrades, and entire battalions collapsed without firing at the Xenos directly. Surviving reports describe the enslavers themselves as rarely engaging in physical combat, instead deploying their psychic mastery to convert humans into proxies. The Imperial forces, unable to maintain chain of command, requested exterminatus within days. Pithos Secundus was sterilized by orbital bombardment, and the administrator marked the world as unsuitable for resettlement for 4 centuries. Another notable record comes from the Orphean Cataclysm, an incident uncovered during the campaigns of the Ordo Xenos. Here, enslavers emerged in a region already destabilized by Necron activity. The Necron disruption of the warp weakened barriers and created uncontrolled psychic echoes, which in turn attracted enslaver infestation. Unlike most encounters, this event provides rare data on multi-faction interaction. The Ordo Xenos dossier notes that Necron forces and Imperial units were both active in containing enslaver infestations, though there was no evidence of cooperation. Engagement reports describe Imperial troops observing Necron constructs methodically exterminating enslaved human populations, their Gorse weaponry cutting through hordes of enthralled hosts with clinical efficiency. While the Imperium ultimately retreated and abandoned several systems, the Necron presence ensured that the infestation did not spread further. This case demonstrates that, while the enslavers are not allies of any species, their predation can disrupt other Xenos empires and force unexpected overlaps in warfare. As for direct battle details, combat analysis consistently indicates that enslavers favor indirect engagement. Their physical forms are vulnerable, large, bloated, and slow. They lack the armor of tyrannid bioforms, the martial ferocity of orcs, or the technological weaponry of the Tau. Yet their psychic domination allows them to bypass the battlefield entirely. In practice, Imperial forces confronting enslavers rarely engage them face to face. Instead, they fight against their own population, enthralled civilians, corrupted psychers, and enslaved soldiers. This transforms battles into chaotic civil wars, where loyalty is uncertain and the enemy may be indistinguishable from allies until their actions reveal their subjugation. Mechanicus autopsies of battlefield corpses suggest that enslaver thralls often suffer catastrophic neurological degradation, their brains scarred by psychic overload. This indicates that domination is not precise but overwhelming, using sheer force of will to compel obedience. The result is that enslaved hosts are dangerous but unstable. In combat, they may act with single-minded aggression, ignoring wounds and fighting until death, but their lack of tactical flexibility makes them vulnerable to coordinated countermeasures if the chain of command can remain intact long enough to exploit this. One particularly well-documented case is the Battle of Carthax Hive, an event preserved in detail due to the presence of an attached inquisitorial observer. Here, a hive city of 12 million was consumed by enslaver infestation after a rogue psyker opened an uncontrolled warp breach. The enslavers arrived in small numbers, but within weeks they controlled tens of thousands of hosts. The Imperial Guard attempted a full-scale purge, but chain of command disintegrated when several high-ranking officers were enthralled. The Inquisitor's report describes the spectacle of entire regiments abandoning orders to stand silently before enslaver figures, waiting for unseen commands. When orbital bombardment was finally ordered, the hive was reduced to rubble, and the planet classified as interdicted. The report concludes not with tactical analysis, but with a doctrinal warning. Enslaver infestation should not be treated as conventional Xenos battles, but as psychic epidemics requiring sterilization rather than suppression. Even in smaller skirmishes, the enslavers' fighting style remains consistent. They do not organize or maneuver in squads. They do not hold territory in a military sense. Their instinct is parasitic: infiltrate, dominate, expand, consume. Once a threshold of hosts is reached, their presence becomes unsustainable, and either the planet collapses entirely, or external intervention destroys both them and their thralls. In this respect, their battlefield is not the open field, but the human mind. This distinguishes them from nearly every other Xeno species. Tyranids consume biomass, orcs seek combat, Tau pursue expansion, and Necrons harvest life. Enslavers seek neither conquest nor resource, but the continuation of their parasitic existence, and every battle fought against them becomes a war for control of cognition itself. The rarity of large-scale records should not obscure their significance. Even a minor infestation can doom a planet, as seen in the records of High Verdamard, where a single uncontrolled psyker's visions triggered an outbreak that consumed half the world before naval bombardment eradicated it. Administratum records classified the loss as acceptable, but Mechanicus data fragments note that over 4 billion lives were extinguished in under 6 months. Such examples highlight that, while they do not wage wars in the conventional sense, every encounter with enslavers carries the risk of planetary annihilation. In conclusion, the history of recorded enslaver battles reflects a pattern of catastrophic asymmetry. Their strength is not measured in numbers or armaments, but in their ability to invert the battlefield, transforming an enemy's own forces into instruments of destruction. The Imperium's responses, orbital sterilization, mass purges, and quarantine, reveal an acknowledgement that conventional military force is insufficient. Thus, the wars of the enslavers are remembered not as victories or defeats, but as disappearances, worlds vanishing into silence, populations erased, and records sealed under classifications of interdiction. The historical record concerning enslaver activity has always been fragmented, marked by the tendency of administratum archivists to excise, redact, or restrict data deemed either destabilizing or too costly to preserve. Nevertheless, within restricted libraries and Mechanicus Nuspheric caches, additional accounts of infestations survive. These records provide further insight not only into the battles themselves, but also into the longer aftermath, how worlds were classified, populations erased, and doctrines adapted. One such case is the fate of the asteroid colonies of the Calthor Belt. Mining outposts with populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands reported anomalous transmissions indicating uncontrolled psychic resonance, likely triggered by unsanctioned witchkin born among the labourers. What followed is reconstructed only from Vox intercepts recovered by an Adeptus Mechanicus exploratory fleet decades later. The intercepts suggest that enslaver entities manifested within days of the first uncontrolled psychic flares. Unlike planetary infestations which unfold across cities and landscapes, the closed environment of the asteroid colonies provided little space for containment. By the time Imperial forces arrived, entire habitats had been overrun. Thralls wandered pressurized corridors, sabotaging life support systems and venting rival populations into the void under Enslaver command. The battle lasted no more than 3 standard days before the fleet judged recovery impossible and detonated the colony's cores with macro ordnance. The aftermath was total loss, the belt marked as interdicted, trade routes diverted, and all surviving records sealed. Another engagement, known to the administratum as the Obrex Incident, highlights the complications of Imperial doctrine. The planet Obrex Prime was a minor agri-world, supplying grain to nearby hive systems. During the mid-40th millennium, psyker activity among the population surged, possibly as a byproduct of warp storms in the surrounding subsector. The Ordo Hereticus dispatched observers, but before investigations were complete, Enslaver incursions destabilized entire districts. Unlike the rapid collapse seen in Pythos Secundus or Carthax Hive, the infestation on Obrex was drawn out over several years. Local militia initially resisted, aided by Astra Militarum reinforcements, but the Enslavers avoided direct confrontation. Instead, they spread their influence slowly through the psychic population, subverting command structures and introducing false orders at key moments. After 5 years of attrition, the Enslavers controlled most of the planetary defense forces, rendering the world effectively compromised. Exterminatus was denied by Administratum petition, as Obrex was considered too valuable a supplier. Instead, the planet was subjected to invasive purges by the Adeptus Arbites and sanctioned psychers, costing millions of lives. Ultimately, Obrex was reclaimed, but subsequent Mechanicus surveys suggest that psychic corruption remained endemic for centuries, undermining the reliability of its exports. The aftermath of Obrex demonstrates the strain that Enslaver infestations can place on Imperial logistics, where the balance between extermination and preservation is weighed not only in lives, but in grain-tithe tallies. The battle for Geron Secundus provides further illustration. This world was garrisoned by 2 full regiments of Astra Militarum, with orbital support and a Mechanicus presence. The arrival of Enslavers was triggered by a catastrophic astropathic failure. A transmission intended for Segmentum Command became a beacon, opening the way for multiple Enslaver entities. The first days of the incursion saw Imperial forces attempt conventional suppression, deploying armoured companies to contain enslaved civilian mobs. Yet as the Enslavers extended their reach, Imperial command broke down. Officers issued contradictory orders, battalions became paralysed in confusion, and Vox networks carried both loyalist and enthralled commands simultaneously. The collapse was compounded when the planetary governor himself fell under domination, using his authority to paralyse defensive coordination. The Mechanicus record notes that within 4 weeks, a world with standing regiments was reduced to chaos. Exterminatus was executed reluctantly, but the aftermath is notable for its bureaucratic implications. The Administratum delayed the declaration of loss for nearly a century, artificially maintaining Geron Secundus as active in records to preserve tithe quotas on neighbouring systems. Only when inquisitorial audits uncovered the discrepancy was the truth disclosed, leading to severe penalties against multiple Administratum scribes. This aftermath demonstrates how Enslaver infestations create not only immediate destruction, but long shadows of administrative distortion. An unusual variation is found in the contested world of Vaelinar, where Enslavers encountered an already ongoing conflict between Orc warbands and Tau expeditionary forces. Surviving fragments from Mechanicus data vaults describe a battlefield in which thralls under Enslaver control engage both Orc mobs and Tau fire cadres. The Orcs, resistant to psychic domination due to their particular neurological structure, fought the enslaved humans directly, seemingly unaware or unconcerned about the Xenos presence. The Tau, less experienced with warp phenomena, mistook the Enslavers for an unconventional Orc stratagem and underestimated the scale of the infestation. As the battle unfolded, Enslaver thralls destabilized both sides, triggering disarray. The Orcs adapted quickly, redirecting their aggression against both the Tau and thralls, while the Tau retreated in confusion. Vaelinar was eventually scoured by an Imperial fleet to prevent further contamination. The aftermath left the system abandoned, yet Mechanicus commentaries emphasize its instructional value, a demonstration that the Enslavers' parasitic warfare destabilizes not only Imperial holdings, but also the conflicts of alien powers, often with unpredictable outcomes. Aftermath analysis across all recorded engagements reveals recurring patterns. Planets affected by Enslavers rarely recover in conventional terms. Even when purges succeed and resettlement occurs, psychic contamination lingers. Populations exhibit higher incidences of mutation, witchbirth, and neural instability for generations. Mechanicus surveys note abnormal resonance in noospheric readings from resettled sites, suggesting that even after physical eradication, the warp imprint of enslaver activity endures. Administratum records often classify such worlds as marginally viable, lowering tithe expectations but still demanding some output. In reality, these worlds become unstable nodes, prone to rebellion, cult activity, or renewed warp anomalies. From the military perspective, the aftermath of enslaver infestations has shaped doctrine. Over time, the Imperial response shifted decisively towards sterilization rather than reclamation. Where early encounters saw extended campaigns of suppression, later centuries record swifter resort to exterminatus. The principle is clear: enslavers cannot be contained once established, and to attempt reclamation is to risk further spread. This doctrinal shift is reflected in the deployment of specialized kill teams, sanctioned psychers, and inquisitorial oversight, all intended to identify infestations early and terminate them before planetary compromise becomes irreversible. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, the aftermath carries different implications. Autopsies of thralls and limited dissections of enslaver corpses have provided rare material for xenobiological study. Yet such studies are often terminated prematurely, either by inquisitorial intervention or by psychic contamination of research personnel. As a result, Mechanicus commentaries frequently express frustration at the paucity of long-term data. This lack of progress, however, is offset by a growing recognition that enslaver infestations represent a systemic hazard to data integrity itself. Administratum archives are distorted by redaction and bureaucratic concealment, Mechanicus data vaults corrupted by psychic bleed, and inquisitorial records sealed beyond access. The aftermath, therefore, is not only planetary ruin but archival silence, the loss of knowledge itself. Taken together, these additional battle records and their aftermath form a composite image of the enslaver threat. Unlike other Xenos powers, whose wars can be mapped, predicted, and measured, the enslavers emerge unpredictably, strike asymmetrically, and leave behind not empires or ruins but absences. Their aftermath is depopulation, psychic scarring, administrative distortion, and archival erasure. For the Imperium, the only consistent response is destruction, followed by silence. Among all the archives of the Imperium, the records of the Inquisition are the most heavily shielded and the most fragmentary. The enslavers, by their very nature, fall into the category of entities the Inquisition regards with unusual caution, not merely for the destruction they cause, but for the way their presence corrupts knowledge itself. Where the Administratum may catalogue loss of population, and the Mechanicus may dissect biological fragments, the Inquisition frames the enslaver as an epistemic hazard, a subject whose very study risks replication of the conditions that allow them to emerge. This impression is consistent across Ordo Xenos, Ordo Malleus, and Ordo Hereticus records, though each arm emphasizes different dimensions of the danger. For the Ordo Xenos, the enslavers represent one of the purest cases of alien parasitism in known history. Their threat is not territorial, ideological, or political, but purely biological and psychic. Unlike the Aeldari, the Orcs, or even the Tyranids, they do not construct civilizations, issue declarations, or wage wars of expansion. They exist only to propagate. This simplicity of purpose does not make them simple to counter. Rather, it renders them unpredictable. Because they lack empire, there are no borders to monitor, no fleets to intercept, no leadership to assassinate. The Ordo Xenos impression, therefore, is one of frustration. When reports surface, they are already late. Once infestations are detected, the protocols for elimination are costly and final. Some inquisitors in this branch note that enslavers function less as an alien race and more as a recurring plague, a phenomenon that arises whenever psychic activity reaches a certain threshold. The Order Malleus, traditionally focused on demonic incursions, views the enslavers with a mixture of uncertainty and suspicion. The boundary between warp predator and warp demon is rarely clean, and while enslavers are categorized as xenos, their reliance on psychic apertures and warp energy creates uncomfortable parallels with demonic possession. Some theorists in this ordo argue that enslavers are not alien life forms in the traditional sense, but are closer to warp fauna, emergent entities that blur the line between biological organism and immaterial predator. This impression shapes doctrine. Where the Order Xenos may argue for autopsies and capture attempts, the Order Malleus typically urges immediate annihilation, regarding any delay as reckless. The impression, in short, is one of absolute hostility, based on the belief that the enslaver's existence may mask deeper warp contamination, even potential demonic collaboration. Though evidence of such links remains absent, the suspicion persists. The Order Hereticus views the enslavers differently still. Their concern lies not in the Xenos themselves, but in the human vulnerabilities they exploit. Every recorded incursion begins with psychers, often unsanctioned, sometimes sanctioned but unstable, who act as beacons for the enslaver's arrival. To the Order Hereticus, this pattern reinforces long-standing dogma. Psychers are not merely dangerous to themselves, but represent catastrophic risk to the Imperium at large. The impression formed within this ordo is that enslaver infestations are not primarily alien incursions, but consequences of human weakness and disobedience. As such, their responses lean heavily on purgation of psychers, stricter controls, and expansion of the Black Ship's remit. In some cases, this impression has hardened into dogmatic certainty, that the enslaver is not an enemy in its own right, but a punishment exacted upon mankind for tolerating uncontrolled psychic development. Across these branches, there is agreement on one matter: the enslavers cannot be allowed to persist once detected. This consensus is reinforced by the nature of the aftermath. Inquisitorial notes frequently remark that worlds touched by enslavers are rarely suitable for resettlement. The lingering psychic taint, the elevated incidence of mutation, and the unreliability of survivor testimony combine to render such sites dangerous long after the infestation has been eliminated. The impression recorded is that destruction is the only true solution, and silence is the only safe aftermath. This explains the abundance of sealed records, the wide use of extermination orders, and the reluctance to share data even within the Inquisition itself. Beyond doctrine, there are personal impressions captured in fragments of interrogations and mission reports. Some inquisitors describe encounters with enslavers not in terms of battle, but in terms of contagion. They note the way conversations are disrupted, chains of command inverted, and loyalties dissolved without physical confrontation. The impression is of a presence that erodes human order from within, converting structure into chaos and comradeship into betrayal. Other reports describe them as voids in the record because their arrival often coincides with corrupted transmissions, disrupted archives, and failed astropathic relays. To the Inquisition, the enslaver is as much an enemy of knowledge as of life. There are two speculative impressions preserved in sealed marginalia. Some suggest that the enslavers may not be discrete organisms at all, but projections of a larger warp ecology. According to this interpretation, each entity encountered in real space is merely an extension of a deeper collective that resides entirely in the warp. The consistency of their behavior across millennia, always seeking psychers, always manifesting the same parasitic control, supports this impression of a singular instinct rather than a diversity of culture. While this view remains unverified, it informs the caution with which inquisitors approach them. If every manifestation is merely an echo of something greater, then the true scope of the enslaver threat cannot be measured by isolated infestations. In other sealed reports, it is speculated that the Enslavers may have once been more prominent during earlier epochs of the galaxy. The aftermath of the War in Heaven, when psychic turbulence was greatest, coincides with widespread records of their presence. By contrast, in the current age they are encountered less frequently. The impression here is that their activity follows cycles of warp instability. Should the warp grow more violent, as many predict during the darkening millennia, Inquisitors fear that enslaver activity may return to catastrophic scale. Thus, their study is not a matter of historical interest, but a preparation for possible resurgence. The final and perhaps most persistent impression among the Inquisition is one of unease regarding categorization. The Imperium thrives on taxonomy, the ability to label, classify and assign threats to specific ordos and protocols. The Enslavers defy this process. They are Xenos, but their reliance on the warp makes them resemble demons. They are biological, but their biology is indistinguishable from weaponry. They are enemies, but they have no agenda beyond propagation. They can be exterminated but not prevented. For the Inquisition, whose role is to enforce order on the incomprehensible, this ambiguity is itself a danger. It is the impression of the unknowable, that there exists in the galaxy a category of threat that cannot be tamed by doctrine, only silenced by annihilation. In summary, the Inquisition's impressions of the Enslavers converge on several points. They are uncontrollable, they are existentially dangerous, and they are to be destroyed on contact. But beyond these practical doctrines lies a deeper unease. Whether regarded as alien, warp predator, or divine punishment, the Enslaver resists comprehension. And in the archives of the Inquisition, to resist comprehension is itself an act of hostility. The Inquisition's archives of wars involving the Enslavers do not resemble standard battle records. Instead of structured accounts of formations, maneuvers, and outcomes, the surviving documentation is uneven, heavily redacted, and littered with unexplained anomalies. For many conflicts, there is no full campaign history, only fragments preserved because they contain evidence of the Enslavers' interference. It is this absence of structure that the Inquisition highlights in its impressions. Whenever the Enslavers intrude, the logic of battle itself seems to dissolve. Command chains fail, communication protocols collapse, and the very sequence of events becomes unreliable. In this sense, anomalies are not incidental. They are characteristic. One example, repeatedly cited in Order Malleus vaults, describes a planetary defense force that turned its weapons inward during a Xenos incursion unrelated to the Enslavers. Surviving fragments indicate that the shift in behavior occurred within a single hour. Initial Vox traffic shows coherent resistance, with artillery barrages targeting enemy positions. Yet subsequent signals show the same artillery batteries reorienting against their own command centers without any detectable change in enemy disposition. Post-battle assessments suggested the presence of Enslaver control, but no physical specimens were recovered. The anomaly lies not only in the sudden reversal, but in the absence of any battlefield trace. The Enslavers appeared to leave nothing behind once their influence was broken, as if the incursion itself was no more than a temporary distortion. Another documented encounter, this one classified within the Ordo Xenos, records the fate of a rogue trader fleet that reported discovering derelict vessels along the fringe of Imperial space. Initial boarding actions were logged as routine, though accounts describe unusually high levels of psychic disturbance among astropaths aboard the fleet. Within days, communications ceased. When recovery vessels eventually located the fleet, all crews were absent. Ships remained operational, systems intact, provisions untouched. No signs of combat damage were recorded, nor was there evidence of boarding by hostile forces. Inquisition notes identify the presence of Enslaver activity as the most likely explanation, though this conclusion is drawn not from physical remains, but from the eerie consistency with other cases. The anomaly here is the absence of destruction. Unlike demonic incursions or tyrannid infestations, which leave unmistakable signatures, the Enslaver leaves silence, abandonment, and the void. There are also sealed reports concerning conflicts where the enslavers appear to act in patterns inconsistent with their known instincts. In the majority of encounters, they seek out psychers and use them as portals or anchors. Yet one set of suppressed accounts from a now exterminated frontier world suggests that enslavers ignored available psychers and instead exerted influence on non-psychic populations. Survivors, if the testimony can be trusted, described entire civilian blocks moving in perfect unison, their eyes unfocused, their movements mechanical. Psychers in the area remained untouched. The anomaly is unresolved, with inquisitorial scholars debating whether the reports were exaggerated, corrupted by hysteria, or whether a rare variant strain of enslavers was at work. The sealed status of these documents reflects the uncertainty. When doctrine insists upon one behavior pattern, acknowledging deviation risks undermining the security of established protocols. The most troubling anomalies are those that suggest persistence beyond extermination. Normally, the destruction of infested hosts and eradication of portals ends an outbreak. Yet a handful of heavily redacted records imply that influence sometimes lingers. In one campaign, the exterminatus of an entire world was followed by centuries of unexplained psychic unrest in the surrounding sector. Vessels transiting the region reported disembodied voices, phantom orders, and navigational errors. The Order Hereticus recommended the sector be declared off-limits for colonization. Whether this was residual warp turbulence, the echo of enslaver presence, or the paranoia of shaken survivors remains unresolved. Still, the impression within inquisitorial notes is clear. Some infestations may never fully end, but leave shadows in the fabric of the warp itself. Encounters recorded during larger wars often come buried within unrelated conflicts. In some cases, enslaver activity emerges during ongoing campaigns between the Imperium and other Xenos. There are fragmentary references in the archives of the Damocles Gulf Crusade, for instance, describing incidents where Imperial regiments abruptly collapsed without Tau intervention. The entries are footnoted but never expanded upon, suggesting suppression. Such anomalies fuel speculation that enslavers exploit active battle zones, using psychic stress and fear as amplification for their arrival. To the Inquisition, this creates a dangerous calculus. Every war the Imperium fights may inadvertently prepare the conditions for further infestation. The sealed reports are often the most disturbing. Within them lie descriptions not meant for wide circulation even among inquisitors. One such record, bearing the mark of Ordo Malleus censorship, describes an Astartes strike team sent to investigate suspected enslaver infestation on a minor hive world. The warriors made planetfall, their transmissions logged in precise detail. Hours later, their signals became garbled, filled with overlapping voices and contradictory orders. For 12 hours, fragments were received, alternating between calls for reinforcement and assurances that the threat had been contained. Then, silence. When the world was subsequently sterilized from orbit, no trace of the Astartes could be found. The anomaly here is the very transmission record. Overlapping voices appear to include not only the strike team, but unidentified speakers repeating Imperial tactical cant. The suspicion in the margin notes is that the enslavers were not merely possessing individuals, but replicating human command structures for their own purposes. The file remains sealed, marked for Ordo-only access. In addition to these battlefield anomalies, the Inquisition maintains dossiers on entire sectors where enslaver presence is suspected but unproven. These cases are marked by elevated psychomortality, unexplained disappearances, and increased incidents of mass hysteria. No confirmed physical encounter has been logged in some of these sectors, yet the pattern is consistent enough to warrant watch. The impression within these sealed reports is that the enslavers may exist on a wider scale than confirmed encounters suggest. They may not always manifest in ways visible to standard military recording, but instead linger at the edges of perception, disrupting without being directly seen. The anomalies of record-keeping themselves are noted as a pattern, where demonic incursions are typically preserved in detail for theological and strategic purposes, and where orc or tyrannid invasions generate exhaustive casualty reports. enslaver incidents are strikingly incomplete. The Inquisition notes a tendency for logs to vanish, Vox archives to corrupt, and astropathic records to fail precisely in relation to their activity. The impression recorded is not simply that enslavers destroy records, but that their presence warps the very means by which records are made. In this way, every sealed file is as much a monument to absence as to presence. These anomalies, documented encounters, and sealed reports form the bulk of what the Inquisition dares to preserve on the enslavers. They show a pattern not of conquest, but of disruption, wars undone from within, fleets lost without battle, populations erased without trace. Where most enemies of the Imperium are catalogued for their weapons and their tactics, the enslavers are catalogued for their distortions. The impression left in the archives is not one of understanding but of disquiet, that there exists an enemy for which documentation itself is unreliable, and whose history is written in gaps, silences, and sealed margins. These anomalies, documented encounters, and sealed reports form the bulk of what the Inquisition dares to preserve on the enslavers. They show a pattern not of conquest, but of disruption, wars undone from within, fleets lost without battle, populations erased without trace. Where most enemies of the Imperium are catalogued for their weapons and their tactics, the enslavers are catalogued for their distortions. The impression left in the archives is not one of understanding but of disquiet, that there exists an enemy for which documentation itself is unreliable, and whose history is written in gaps, silences, and sealed margins. The most heavily classified documents concerning the enslavers are stored within the innermost vaults of the Order Malleus, preserved under cipher-locked seals that permit access only to those sanctioned at the highest level. These files differ in character from ordinary records. Where battlefield reports and after-action summaries aim to describe observable events, classified materials are fragmentary by design, preserving only what cannot be safely dismissed. They represent the moments when inquisitorial observers believed they had glimpsed something beyond established doctrine. One such file contains the transcript of an astropathic choir collapse aboard a black ship. The event is described not as a failure of discipline or an accident of warp exposure, but as an intrusion. The voices recorded during the collapse included the astropaths themselves screaming in unison, but also voices in unfamiliar tongues layered across the transmission. Linguistic analysis failed to assign them to any known human or Xenos dialect. For 12 seconds, the choir broadcast nothing but overlapping speech, an impossible simultaneity that left every receiver on board incapacitated. The transcript ends abruptly, followed by a margin note. Presence consistent with enslaver manipulation. Choir termination authorized. No further detail is provided, and the record is marked sealed. Another classified entry describes the fate of a kill team deployed by the Ordo Xenos against what was initially believed to be a minor infestation of unsanctioned psychers. The team's Vox records indicate routine progression through an abandoned settlement until their commander began issuing contradictory orders. Within minutes, all squad channels carried voices repeating the same words in a precise cadence. Subsequent transcripts show team members identifying one another by name, yet responding with unfamiliar tones. The record ends with a phrase repeated across all channels. The passage is open. At this point, the monitoring Inquisitor terminated the feed and ordered orbital sterilization. What stands out in the classified annotation is not the loss of the squad, such outcomes are common, but the suspicion that enslavers had begun using Imperial tactical cant as a structural template for their communication. The file remains sealed on the grounds that confirmation of such mimicry could undermine faith in command hierarchies across the wider Imperium. There are also classified accounts of attempts to capture enslaver specimens for study. These efforts, almost universally failures, reveal more about the dangers of even attempting containment than they do about the Xenos themselves. In one such operation, a Mechanicus-aligned faction within the Ordo attempted to construct a null-shielded chamber designed to hold an enslaver under stasis. The classified file contains the testimony of the Enginseer Prime responsible for the chamber's design. According to the testimony, The chamber never functioned as intended. Instruments registered constant activity inside, yet visual inspection revealed nothing present. Crew assigned to monitor the chamber began to show signs of possession-like behavior within hours, repeating fragments of machine cant in unison, then falling silent. Eventually, the entire facility was purged, its location scrubbed from charts. The classified annotation concludes, "Containment impossible. Contact inevitably results in infestation." Sealed materials also include evidence of enslaver activity during periods of otherwise well-documented conflict. A file originating from the era of the Horus Heresy is marked under Ordo Temporis consultation, though its authenticity is contested. It describes a detachment of loyalist forces encountering resistance that did not correspond to any known traitor legion or Xenos. Vox transcripts, already fragmentary due to the war's chaos, describe warriors fighting in complete silence, their movements described as puppet-like, their coordination impossible to explain. The classified note appended centuries later identifies these as potential enslaver-controlled hosts. If true, this would suggest the creatures were active during one of the most formative periods of Imperial history, though their presence was suppressed from all wider accounts. Whether the file is genuine or a later interpolation remains unresolved, but the decision to seal it reflects the Inquisition's reluctance to allow even the possibility that the enslavers once interfered in the heresy. Classified files sometimes contain anomalies that defy even minimal rationalization. A notable example concerns a derelict station in the Eastern Fringe. Explorators boarded the facility and discovered intact life support, functioning systems, and a complete absence of crew. In place of personnel, the station's vox logs played continuous loops of voices requesting assistance in ancient dialects of High Gothic. Some phrases corresponded to distress signals dating back thousands of years. Others were unfamiliar entirely. When the station was investigated further, the logs ceased. The Inquisition seized the records and sealed them under enslaver classification, noting that the phenomenon matched neither demonic mimicry nor Xenos infiltration as previously understood. The classified annotation speculates that the enslavers may be able to capture and repurpose human voices across centuries, storing them within their psychic resonance as tools for manipulation. No further study has been attempted. The deepest vaults also contain records of psychers who survived exposure. These individuals are few, and every classified file concerning them is marked with extermination orders. Survivors describe a condition not of possession in the traditional sense, but of layered perception, the sense that their thoughts were not replaced but duplicated, their decisions shadowed by alternatives that were not their own. One survivor's testimony includes the line, "I could feel myself deciding, but I could also feel something else deciding through me." The classified annotation notes that such survivors posed an existential risk, since even after physical separation from enslaver influence, they continued to broadcast psychic residue. The Inquisition's final measure in all such cases was termination. Final reflections from the Inquisition perspective emphasize caution over certainty. The most consistent theme across classified files is that the enslavers resist categorization. Every attempt to fit them into familiar frameworks, whether as predators, manipulators, or invaders, breaks down under closer inspection. They are not an army in the traditional sense, yet they can unmake armies. They do not occupy territory, yet their presence can erase worlds. They are not demons, though their methods echo the warp. They are not Xenos in the ordinary sense, though they originate beyond the human frame of understanding. The Inquisition concludes that they belong to the class of threats that destabilize the very categories by which the Imperium organizes its knowledge. From the Inquisition's perspective, the true danger of the enslavers is not their power, but their ambiguity. Enemies that can be understood can be resisted. Even the Great Devourer follows a biological imperative that can be analyzed. Even chaos, in its mutability, still plays by the logic of corruption. The enslavers offer no such pattern. They manifest unpredictably, operate without apparent purpose, and leave behind no consistent trace. For this reason, The Ordo Malleus and Ordo Xenos maintain their files under the highest level of restriction, judging that widespread awareness of their existence would not improve defense, but rather spread uncertainty. Final analysis entries in the most restricted records summarize the threat in terms of containment, not eradication. The Enslavers cannot be destroyed as a species, for they do not appear to function as a species in the conventional sense. They emerge when conditions align, then vanish. The only measure the Imperium can reliably employ is denial, exterminatus of compromised worlds, isolation of sectors showing signs of infestation, and the purging of records that might encourage recognition. In this way, the Inquisition wages not a war of arms, but a war of silence. The ultimate conclusion found in these files is stark. The Enslavers are a presence that cannot be defeated, only endured, and their true nature may remain forever beyond the reach of Imperial comprehension. Thus the classified files close not with resolution, but with caution. Where most enemies are recorded in terms of battles fought and victories won, the Enslavers are recorded in terms of records sealed and truths withheld. The Inquisition's final thought, preserved only for those cleared to read it, is that the greatest anomaly of the Enslavers is not in their biology or their methods, but in the fact that they have survived across millennia without ever being fully known. In a galaxy defined by war, they remain an enemy that resists war's logic. The implication, though never stated openly, is that they may not be enemies at all in the way the Imperium understands. They may be something else entirely, an intrusion not just into human worlds but into human categories of knowledge. The Inquisition accepts this ambiguity as both a necessity and a burden, sealing its files accordingly, leaving behind the silence of locked vaults where truths are preserved but never spoken.